Back in 2019, Airbnb ran an interesting leap experiment on their product detail pages. The experiment actually contained multiple changes in a single variation, what some might refer to as a redesign of sorts. Nevertheless, just by observation, the experiment was rejected and did not make it through into implementation. But that's not the full story, because Airbnb did manage to take some of these changes and implement them over time, over a course of other experiments, other leap experiments, other follow-up smaller experiments. And that's what I wanted to share today. I wanted to share which changes made it through. All right, let's dig into it because there's quite a few changes here, with the first difference being the restyling of the property images or photos. And quite visibly here we see additional indentation on the numerous property images, as well as additional padding between the images. I'm not sure whether this is better or worse here, but this basically did not make it initially in 2019. However, in 2020, already with additional leap experiments, this became the status quo, the control, and it's also visible up until today. We do have a little bit of faint and weak, I'd rather say, evidence to support that pattern. There is something we tested ourselves with additional photos that are somewhat grid-like and indented. So this is a bit of a far stretch, I admit, and this is slightly different, but maybe perhaps it does share some similarity with what Airbnb has been doing. More so additional very weak evidence, but given where booking has been going and given that they do experiment, I haven't really captured whether this was an experiment or not, but there is an evolutionary path between an older booking property page and your one, which kind of also goes into the direction of using these more grid-like photos that showcase properties. Jumping to a next difference here is going back to 2019, the initial leap experiment. We did notice there was a removal of view photos, and perhaps that contributed in some negative way to why it was initially rejected. In future iterations, future tests, that show all photos button came back and did invite users to kind of open up additional photos. Moving on to another feature which was tested initially in the leap experiment from 2019 was this translate feature here. And this did not make it through. This was quickly rejected and never to be seen again, which perhaps isn't surprising, as Chrome is doing quite a good job in translating and other web browsers are doing the same. And perhaps this distracts. Moving on to another difference in the original 2019 leap experiment, we observed there was a usage of links versus more visible ghost buttons. And this was initially rejected. However, very soon afterwards, these actual more visible buttons made it through. And we do have some evidence to support that under pattern links or buttons, which measures conversions from having more visible buttons essentially. Another quite prominent difference in the original experiment was the oversimplification of the buy box here, with some fields actually being removed, such as the check-in dates, checkout dates, the number of guests being asked for. And although this variant here was rejected, perhaps again being oversimplified, it did continue to evolve into elements where the check availability as the first initial ask was kept, as well as additional language was used to reinforce that, hey, if you add dates, you will be rewarded with prices right after. And I think this is also supported by a pattern called Gradual Reassurance, which suggests that sometimes asking for additional information in order to increase relevancy is a good thing. And if we look more closely, there's another little copy difference here, which has disappeared in the initial experiment. You won't be charged yet. This is no longer visible in the 2019. However, in the latest versions, we see that kind of resurgence of that copy. And that's also something we measured under a pattern called Pay Later, which reinforces that payment can happen later and not today. Moving on to the calendar, which was heavily adjusted, we can also see a couple differences here. One of which is the increase in the calendar size, as well as the position change of it being pushed further down. But perhaps another negative difference here is the fragmentation of this kind of widget into two inputs. On one hand, we see the check-in, check-out dates as input fields, and on the right, we see the actual calendar. Perhaps this created some sort of ambiguity or tension between which input to use. And perhaps some of this is visible in the 2024 version, where that calendar comes back to more of its original state. Scrolling further down on the page, we can see adjustments to the map, which increased in size and was lifted higher. And in 2024, it was pushed back down, but maintained its size. Moving on to amenities, these have continued to kind of evolve in the direction of showing more of them, which is also visible up until today. The styling of the reviews also evolved, with them trying to take up more space, as well as being more consolidated into a single component with more uniform styling, larger numbers, larger labels. Jumping to reviews, we can also see them kind of evolving towards a two-column layout, no pagination, but essentially a show all, a dedicated page for all of them, and perhaps more compact. Last but not least, the footer also continued to evolve, with it taking up more space, receiving more padding, as well as being kind of more disconnected or more unique from the rest of the content of the page. So yeah, hopefully this inspires you to run additional experiments on one hand. On the other, perhaps this little story illustrates how larger and smaller experiments work together to get through and evolve certain products and services in a more coherent way.